Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, everyone. Today's virtual Commonwealth Club event. I'm Jiyoung Fan, a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, and author of a book that is currently non-existent, that hopefully will come into being sometime next year, called Motherland. The club would like to thank the Asian Pacific Affairs Forum for supporting today's event. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Josh Chen and Liza Lin, authors of Surveillance State: Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control. Josh serves as the Deputy Bureau Chief in China for the Wall Street Journal. He is a National Fellow at New America and recipient of the Dan Boyles Prize medal awarded to investigative journalists who exhibited courage in standing up to intimidation. And Liza is the China correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and previously worked at Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Television. Liza was part of the investigative team led by Josh that won the Gerald Loeb Award for International Reporting in 2018 for a series exposing the Chinese government's pioneering embrace of digital surveillance. I'd like to just encourage everyone to please submit any questions for Josh and Liza throughout the chat, through the chat on YouTube, if questions come to you. And Josh and Liza, welcome. It's so strange. I mean, I'm in New York, to still be doing a Zoom event when, like, just outside, like literally in the bar below my apartment, there are like 100 people packed indoors. So let me acknowledge the strangeness of the kind of the Zoomness of this event, but it's quite fitting with the book about digitalization of control and surveillance. And I would like to start by just asking Josh and Liza how you became interested in writing a book. I know that both of you have done terrific pieces on surveillance in Xinjiang and in China, but what made it worth it for you guys to invest so much of your time and energy and into putting this into together into a book?
Yeah.
Right. So thanks, John. It's great to see. I mean, the Zoomness of this event at least allows us to be in conversation with you despite being halfway across the country, which makes it really worth it, I think. So I'm just speaking for myself personally. I mean, I was a reporter in China for more than a dozen years, and to be a journalist in China is to think about writing a book, right? It's one of those things that people ask you, even if you don't ask yourself, like, are you going to write a book? And I never wanted to write just a journalist in China book, and not because I don't like the genre, I love it, but there's just so many good examples of it already, right? I mean, from the very beginning, over decades, they're just classics of that genre, and it sort of felt like, it's frankly just really difficult to top those books, right? And so I always figured if I was going to write a book, I wanted it to be about something specific. And, in the course of, I've done tons of stories over the year, and some of them, a lot of them have felt really significant. But this set of reporting, the series of stories that Liza and I worked on for the Wall Street Journal starting in 2017 was just it just felt like it was scratching the surface of a really monumental change, right, in China, and the way that the Communist Party was altering the way it governs China and what that meant for Chinese people's lives, right? There was just a fundamental shift in how and how Chinese people were relating to the government, to technology, to themselves, to their own aspirations. And it just sort of felt like it felt like the kind of thing that required more sort of space than you could get in a newspaper article, right? It was something, it was a story that I wanted to sit with for longer. I was hoping, the readers would also kind of want to sit with as well.
Yeah, and I guess, on my part, like Josh, I've been in China for quite a while, 8 years in total. And if I ever thought about writing a China book, because I covered China tech in China, I covered the stories of Alibaba, I covered the stories of Tencent. I never expected to be this, if I had to focus on something, I never expected it to be surveillance. What really, I guess, nailed it for me that this was worth exploring and deeply researching was, I think, the fact that, in 2017, when we stumbled on this company, SenseTime, which is China's largest AI company, when we interviewed them and we went out to their showroom to see what surveillance systems they were developing, it was just so jarring that it felt like we were living in a movie. People who live in China always feel like they're living in some sort of bizarre, kind of haphazard, chaotic movie, but this was absolutely different. And I knew that it would have bigger repercussions down the road. And these like AI-enabled surveillance systems, when they started popping up in Xinjiang, that was when I knew, something really sinister was afoot, and we should look closely into it.
Yeah, I mean, I found this book so educational and kind of expansive and exploring sort of one of the most important questions in China at a time when there is so much surveillance about, I think, just this very subject and this dampening of more than dampening, I think, this repression of free speech. So to me, this book felt very, very timely at a time when control, I think, extends to the birth of books on this subject. I also just love the way that the personal narratives, whether of someone kind of trapped in lockdown during COVID or of a Uyghur family, is threaded with these larger questions of control and surveillance and what is it like to be living in and through these systems. I mean, as a writer, really marveled at the way that you guys, massaged kind of these two, the personal narrative with the exploration of these larger socio-political questions. I mean, I really marveled at how seamless it was. Can you talk a little bit about, the writing process and how, how kind of you made sense of the beast that is inevitably kind of the process of book writing?
Yeah, that was a challenge right from the beginning. I think that, particularly when you're writing about China, right, the way that China exists in the American imagination or the Western imagination is really, it's still, often a kind of this monolithic, strange, exotic place across the ocean. And so we knew that writing about this topic, it would be easy. We knew this partly because there were sort of other books that had touched on it, but we knew that it would be easy to sort of create a sort of detached, kind of menacing, but like one-dimensional or, maybe two-dimensional sort of big brother sort of apparition, and that people would be scared of. And, and maybe that would sell books, it probably would sell books, but like we really wanted to sort of, as people who had lived in China for as long as we had, right, we really wanted to conjure China in as much of its complexity as possible. I mean, obviously, it's a country of 1.4 billion people. You know, you can never capture even a fraction of it in a book. But we wanted to try to do that as much as we could, and we particularly wanted, with this subject, to look at how it affects lives, right? How it affects, like, what does it mean for an actual human being to sort of go through this, and what do they think about, right? And what are the questions that they weigh? And you know, and you know, there are multiple aspects of a surveillance state in China, right? There is this really kind of dystopian, just terrifying, dark expression of it in Xinjiang, in the northwest part of China, which, you know, I'm sure people watching are familiar, but, you know, there's the Communist Party has been running this just unprecedented, really kind of shocking, forcible assimilation campaign against Turkic Muslim groups there, including Uyghurs, right? And they're using these technologies to track and categorize basically every single individual in that region, right? And it is like this, the surveillance there is suffocating, it is inescapable, it is constant, right? And so what is that experience? What is it like? I mean, how many people have ever actually lived in that? Probably actually no one, right? To that point, when they were rolling it out, the Uyghurs, it was a unique experience kind of in history. And so we wanted to explore that, but we also wanted to see what it was like for people who lived in like wealthier cities on the East Coast, you know, who had a totally different experience of essentially the exact same technologies, in some cases made by the same companies, right? And like, how do they weigh the costs and benefits of being tracked all of the time, and how are those calculations different? And you know, the writing of it was a challenge, right? It was kind of trying to how to balance, you know, how to kind of dive in and out of these narratives, right? So that people are sort of keeping track of the big picture, but also able to sort of stick with the story. And that was, you know, that's partly why this book took so long to write. But yeah, that was what we were trying to do.
And in terms of the reporting process, like, we wanted to ground like every chapter in a narrative. So how it played out would be, you know, we would interview dozens of people and eventually settle on one person whose story we felt really needed to be told. And once that happened, it was a matter of spending just a lot of time asking this person, can you recollect, you know, what happened last week, right down to the very detail of, you know, when you woke up and when you got a phone call from a government authority. And in this case, I referred to a girl that I interviewed who basically, she was tracked after she had left the Chinese city of Wuhan after COVID had broken out there, and government officials tracked her down using cell phone signals, you know, one of the users of the surveillance state. And she was asked to, once she was tracked down, she was asked to quarantine and isolate herself for 14 days. So you'd have to ask her, you know, what were you doing, or where were you when you got that call? What does your room look like? What did your room look like then? Or if you were eating, what were you having then? And that all just made the book a much more richer experience.
Yeah, no, that very much. I could tell kind of that there was kind of this very delicate balance in the book between exploring the bigger questions and grounding them in, you know, narratives that made us appreciate what lives, how these lives are lived. But it also made me, as a writer, get a sense, you know, appreciate the difficulty of such a project. And given its difficulty, I think you guys were actually very expedient. You know, shorter, you know, less complex books have taken far longer. So one, you know, one, you know, thread throughout the book is this, I mean, which you guys explore in length, is China's perspective, especially the Chinese government's perspective of equating stability with control. And I think that is that was really important. And I think the book made that, really kind of gave us an ample idea of why, you know, that is, and how technology becomes an instrument of control. Would either kind of one of you like to talk a little bit about kind of the stability and control, really kind of give us a sense of the government's rationale for drawing this equal sign between the two? Because I think this is at the heart of so much how the Chinese government justifies its draconian measures.
Yeah, that's a great question, John. I think I've been thinking about this in particular now because we have Xi Jinping, right, coming up on the 20th Party Congress this next month, where he's expected to sort of basically be named. Well, people are expecting he could take a third term and essentially be president or head of the party for life, right? And so inevitably there are all these comparisons to Mao, right? Because Xi is probably the most powerful leader, arguably the most powerful leader since Mao. And so I've been thinking about the differences between the Communist Party under Mao and the Communist Party since, right? And Mao, he sort of ruled by, like a lot of revolutionary leaders, just through sort of sheer force of charm and will and charisma, and he was a really kind of chaotic influence or a chaotic leader. And China basically since then the Communist Party since Mao, since the Cultural Revolution ended, has really prioritized stability over everything. They've sort of made it just a core element of how they rule. And what's interesting is that they've changed the way that they go about cultivating stability, right? So in the immediate kind of reform era, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, it was all about economic growth, right? It was about delivering sort of economic well-being, or at least the possibility of economic well-being to Chinese people. So and it was extremely successful, right? For like 3 decades, it was double-digit economic growth, a bunch of the time. Everyone sort of felt like, if they weren't getting rich, they had the possibility of getting rich, and they were watching their standards of living go up. And the social contract at the time with the Communist Party was, we'll do this for you. Just don't call for us to be taken down. Don't call for democracy. Don't make too much trouble. And that was a stable, extremely successful model for many, many years. But that model is kind of fraying now. And that's partly natural. There's just no country in the world in history has ever maintained the levels of economic growth that China has had. So it was bound to slow down. And then other factors like COVID, for example, have sort of accelerated that process, right? So China's economic growth now is close to zero. It might even be negative. And so how do you replace that if you're the Communist Party, right? How do you maintain stability and maintain legitimacy? And really what they've been doing over the past few years, as we discovered, is kind of offering a technologically enhanced life that is sort of safe and convenient and predictable, right? And so they can use these technologies to kind of just make your life easier, right? They make traffic flow better. They make it easier to sort of, you can scan your face to get on the subway. You can pay for basically anything you want to pay for on your phone. And that's really the sort of new, that is what they are betting on.
Yeah, I mean, the line kind of in the book that really struck me was kind of how technology enables the party to anticipate the needs of the people while rooting out threats to its power. And it occurred to me that it was exactly the kind of paternalism that underlies Chinese Communist Party, that has underlied its control kind of since the beginning. That at its best, it's kind of this father-like figure who's saying, I will know, like, you are my children, I will know what you need before you do. And it kind of reminded me of how a pair, young friends of mine who've just become parents in the age of digitalization, where you can keep track of everything on your phone, in fact. And the baby is like 3 months old, and everything it's been fed and everything it has voided has been documented meticulously and has been, and I joked that if this baby ever became the president, I mean, the presidential archives would, would require multiple libraries, because you would have, since birth, like from the baby's, first shit, like would be recorded. And it occurred to me that that is something, I mean, as these very, these friends of mine are very, very good parents, and basically, they explained, they said, well, we need all this information basically to make the best prediction of how she will be possibly malnourished, or like, why is she acting cranky, like all this. The collection of all this information is to basically prevent medical crises from before they can even occur. And I wondered if either of you kind of had thoughts on, obviously there is a like draconian paternalistic ideology at work here. But is there an argument for I guess my friends who are parents kind of a way of thinking, which is that collecting all this information will ensure that the baby never becomes, toddler becomes, sick kind of beyond beyond the baby, beyond the parent's ability to kind of take it to the ER at the earliest at its earliest convenience. I mean, is there an argument that it is preventing like crises from reaching a boiling point?
Yeah, so I could probably take that. I mean, what you're referring to essentially would be the attractiveness of using surveillance in like ways that, to actually help a city run more efficiently, or help keep law and order on the streets, help keep streets clean. And you're right, smart cities basically use the same sort of surveillance systems that do like racial profiling in Xinjiang, that do real-time tracking of the ethnic minority in order to oppress them. That it's like two sides of the coin. The same sort of technology can be put to different uses. And this is one of the more interesting findings from our research, because we went into the book thinking that state surveillance in China was inherently negative and sinister. But the more we dug into this, and the more we spoke to people, particularly in the wealthier cities, the wealthy big cities on the East Coast, for example, the more I realized that there are aspects to state surveillance that are very alluring and attractive.
Right.
So to do that, what we did was we profiled a city called Hangzhou, and Hangzhou is on the eastern coast of China. It's not as well known as Shanghai, but it's actually home to the Chinese internet giant Alibaba. And it's also home to the world's largest surveillance camera maker, which is called Hikvision. And because of this reason, Hangzhou as a city government is just very embracing of using tech to digitize every sort of like city, every means of running a city. So they've actually used the same surveillance systems and made by often like Hikvision as well, which made the same systems in Xinjiang. They're using these systems to smooth out traffic, for example. So you would have cameras at every road intersection in Hangzhou, and they would be, figuring out what the density of the cars were at that point in time, and using that combined with other data such as GPS from the maps on the cars, they would use that to optimize traffic lights. So in days of heavy traffic, your traffic lights will be green for a longer time, and so on. And I think the other really interesting thing the interesting use that we found of image recognition and like surveillance cameras in these cities is the city cameras would easily spot, for example, cars illegally parked on the street. And, that would be something, so they would spot cars parked on the street and they would flag it to the law and order officials who would come to essentially get rid of the car as soon as possible. This would be something that would have in the past taken much longer because you had human patrols. And in this case, with surveillance camera and AI, you have a patrol, like someone patrolling 24/7, someone flagging out incidents in the city happening 24/7. And it wasn't just that. You could use the same AI systems to discover flooding in a city when in times of heavy rain, or missing manhole covers, which can be very dangerous, particularly if you have children running around. So there were these very attractive aspects to state surveillance, and the people that we interviewed in the city, they knew that a lot of data was being taken, but they're very happy to make the trade-off because they got something in return.
Yeah, that was, I mean, one of the really, I mean, there was really interesting questions that the book raises is the value of privacy to the Chinese. I thought that was something, I was very grateful that that subject was being explored, because that was something, having grown up in China, not really having known even the term until later in life. It just didn't it doesn't quite have the same value and importance to the average American as it does to the average Chinese. And I, in the book, you very you guys talk about how I mean, you quote a certain, Xu Bing, a very well-known Chinese artist, as saying, the idea of privacy largely belongs to, is to the wealthy and the educated. It's the province of the wealthy and the educated. And I wanted to ask about how that, was that for the two of you, through writing this book, was that a surprise to learn? And that did that at all kind of affect your view about the kind of mass surveillance that the government is undertaking, that the Chinese have? I mean, at least some, a good number, a good fraction of the population have such a different idea of privacy than Americans.
Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating, and I mean, actually, sort of difficult parts of this whole process, writing this book, right? And many sort of aspects of the story evolved or swerved as we were writing it, which is again partly why it took longer than we'd hoped. But yeah, privacy was really fascinating, and actually, Xu Bing, that story sort of evolved as we were reporting it, right? So the background of this is that Xu Bing is this extremely well-known artist. I think he's got he's a MacArthur genius. And one of the things he likes to do is just he's very interested in this idea of transformation and of taking things out of one context and putting them in another. And so we had encountered him at an event, and I had just asked him, what he was working on. And he's like, "Oh, I'm making a movie out of surveillance footage." And actually, this is before we even were really looking in surveillance as a story, but I'd sort of filed that away in the back of my mind. And then, when we wrote the book, I went back to him, and so what he was really intrigued by this idea. He wanted to do this because he thought people who appeared in surveillance footage seemed more real than actors, right? And he just liked that idea, and he was intrigued by this notion that you could sort of somehow weave together. If you could get enough surveillance footage, you could weave it together into a fictional narrative. And so, I mean, for years he tried to do it, but he couldn't because it was just too hard to collect. He was collecting footage on tape from friends in the police and officials he knew, and it was just like not feasible. But eventually what happened was one of his research assistants was searching the internet one day and stumbled on this website that was basically was set up by a company called Qihoo 360, which is a internet security company, but they also produce these sort of cheap, in-home security cameras, right, that are connected to the web. And they had set up a website, a platform, right, where if you owned a camera, you could access the footage from that camera online. And which is a lot of cameras do this, but in Qihoo's case, they made the default setting public right? So that if you knew about this website, you could go there and you could watch all of these people's surveillance footage, right? Then like, and you know, if they didn't put a password on it, you could just, you essentially watch what was going on in their homes or their businesses or wherever. And so this was like a, you know, a bonanza for him. He immediately, you know, set up a bunch of computers, was downloading footage, you know, 24 hours a day. And then he and a bunch of his assistants kind of weaved it together into this movie. And I just thought that was fascinating. He described it as sort of being like, you know, that these cameras had turned China into the version of the Truman Show, you know, the Jim Carrey movie about the guy who's sort of born in a movie studio in a movie set, but he doesn't know it. And so I thought that was just fascinating as a sort of statement about Chinese privacy, that there were all of these feeds across the country. People seemed to not be bothered by them. They were actually entertained by them, you know, and it was like surveillance television. And so we were sort of writing up the chapter on that basis, right? Like, you know, here's an example of how little Chinese people care about privacy. And you know, shortly after he finished the film, he was taking it on tour to various film festivals, and all of a sudden this controversy blew up on the Chinese internet, on Chinese social media over these sites. There were multiple sites where a woman had sort of, she'd been watching the feeds and she pointed out, like, you know, there were some inside like yoga studios, right? There were like clearly scenes that people probably didn't want in public, right? Or like, you know, children dancing, kind of creepy stuff, you know, or people having dates in restaurants where they were kind of like, you know, sitting close together, being intimate. And she wrote this outrage post to the CEO of that company, and it just exploded. It became this massive thing. And within days, the company had to shut down the site, and every other company that had one of those shut down their sites. Right. And so we were like, what is going on, you know? And I think what that pointed to was there is this sort of evolving privacy consciousness in China, but it's new, right? And it's really malleable and unpredictable. And, you know, I mean, it's funny, Jia, you talking about not knowing the word for privacy until you were older. Well, like, you know, the word like 隐私, the Chinese word for privacy, didn't appear in the Xinjiang or the Xinhua, like official Chinese dictionary, until the late 1990s, right? So, I mean, a lot of people didn't. You couldn't even look it up, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, so like I think now what you have is this very malleable idea. I mean, it is powerful, very powerful for some people, but it's, you know, it tends to be kind of directed mostly at companies. You know, the government is and the government has embraced it, but embraced it in a way that directs it in areas that it wants it to go, which is rarely at the government itself. But you know, we could see this change, I think, a little bit with the COVID pandemic. You might actually start to see it shift again, and it's, you know, so it is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the book, you guys talk about how it is the government has conveniently welded the concept of privacy to that of collective security of the people, and that, you know, you're giving up kind of this abstract concept that like you barely had a word for, you know, in the dictionary even a few decades ago. And what you get is a safe and serene life, which seems like a good bargain if, you know, if like privacy wasn't something that was terribly important or even kind of like clear to you as a concept. I mean, not too long ago. I like how you guys and maybe Liza can talk about this, how you guys also bring surveillance to the US, and, you know, using it, you know, the way that the American police force, you know, have to scan for, you know, shoplifters, or everything from shoplifters to, you know, January 6th, the facial recognition software that allowed, you know, the government to identify, you know, the people who stormed the Capitol. So clearly, America, or the American government, is trying to strike this delicate balance between security and the preservation of privacy. How, you know, where, you know, what was it like reporting that out, and did it make you kind of change your mind at all about, you know, America's position on the preservation of privacy? Did the US seem like its position has been consistent as the technology for surveillance has grown?
Yeah, so the US is definitely one where we've seen its position kind of shift, but the difference between the US and China is like the scale and the breadth of the ambition that China is trying to achieve. In the US, a lot of the security cameras are privately owned. They're not government run. So yes, there are a lot of surveillance cameras in the US, but it's not all in the hands of the government. Whereas in China, you have more than 400 million cameras on the street, you know, all streaming video, all basically data that the national security agencies in China could easily get hold of. I think the difference for me when I was exploring surveillance in the US versus China was how, you know, the concentration of so much data and all these data feeds in the hands of one entity. In the US, surveillance is not a new thing. You've had government surveillance, and it particularly spiked after the 9/11. And you also have what Shoshana Zuboff has coined surveillance capitalism, where a lot of data has been sucked up by internet companies like Facebook or Google. The difference in China is that, you know, in the US, it's very fragmented. The data is either with corporations or with government entities or state security agencies. You know, when I think of the government entities with data, you think of the DMV, which has everybody's driver's license data. And then, you know, it's very rare to see the data basically being shared between the DMV, shared freely between the DMV and Google and the FBI. Whereas in China, what's different is the Chinese government has access to a lot of the data that its internet companies have as well. So if you think about what the Chinese government can gather, it can gather data from all its surveillance camera feeds. It also has access to data from Alibaba. For example, Alibaba runs e-commerce, so they know what you buy. It also has access to data from China's biggest social media app, which is WeChat. It's kind of like a WhatsApp, so the Chinese government will know who your contacts are. And all this because, you know, the laws in China just make it very easy for state security agencies to get that sort of data. So the difference between like China and the US, to me, that really stands out is the ability to concentrate that data in one place, and how one entity, which is the Chinese government, has access to it all. That's not something you see in the US.
Yeah, I was just say on the privacy aspect, or sort of comparing the US and China, you know, there are some sort of universal things we noticed that were really surprising, right? When we were, you know, talking to people in China, and John, I'm sure you've had this experience, right? But if you talk to people in China and you ask them, like, well, what do you think about all of this? Like, what do you think about being tracked by the government, and the fact that they can read your WeChat messages and all that? And like, you know, the sort of default response is what? Like, well, if you haven't done anything wrong, what do you have to fear? Right. And that was sort of that was really common. You know, we talked to, you know, got dozens of people, hundreds of people just to get their responses to this sort of thing. And I started to think of that partly because I lived in China for so long as just like a Chinese response, you know, like it was like, okay. But then, you know, when I went to the US in the middle of writing this book, I remember this vividly, standing in JFK in the airport in New York City in line and listening to a couple discuss an article in a Western newspaper about China's state surveillance, and the wife being like, "Oh my God, can you believe it?" And the husband delivering the exact same line, basically saying, "Well, why? Like, if you haven't done anything wrong, you don't need to worry about it, right?" And it was just like, it was so striking that was, you know. It's sort of, I think it's a default for a lot of people around the world, right? I think it's a really common attitude. And so I think, you know, Americans in particular are, I mean, speaking of Google or Amazon, Facebook, Americans are very willing to give up personal information for convenience, right? It's just that they don't, it's not in the hands of the state, right? And so that the big difference is, as Lisa says, is, you know, in China, it's a much starker, the trade-offs are much starker.
Right. I liked, I mean, part of the one of the nice things about, you know, the book taking multiple years to complete is that you guys got to address the pandemic. And I think the I think the pandemic was an occasion for which where you um these surveillance tools were both able to show their advantages and kind of the disadvantage of being completely imprisoned by the information that they yield. How did that, I mean, you how did reporting kind of on the state of like, did you guys go into the pandemic expecting surveillance to shape the pandemic response in one way, or did this kind of, or did you feel like, yes, like, you know, in case of a once in a century plague, surveillance has its upsides? Like, what was your thought process as you were witnessing, you know, the relationship between surveillance technology and response to the pandemic?
Yeah, the pandemic was really unexpected for us. I guess, you know, like China, nobody saw it coming. So when the pandemic actually hit, we had no idea about the implications of state surveillance. It was only as it started to unfold, we realized that China was turning its entire state surveillance apparatus against tracking the virus. Because when the pandemic first broke out in the city of Wuhan, they had announced that they were going to shut the city at 10 a.m. the very next day. And because there were so many people worried about being shut in the city, in the city itself, and it was also Chinese New Year, so it coincided with the one time everybody travels back to see their family. So before 10 a.m. the next day, hundreds of people rushed to the train station to leave Wuhan. Hundreds of people who would have been close contacts or possible carriers of the virus. And what the Chinese government did next was really surprising, and it shocked me, but it showed me how powerful state surveillance was. The Chinese government basically asked the state telcos to hand over data of whose cell phone number was in Wuhan at that point of time. And it's in China, it's very easy to link your cell phone number back to the identity, because in order to buy a SIM card, you have to register with an ID card. So the government knows who owns this particular number. And that was how they managed to catch the first wave of people who were leaving from Wuhan and to ask them to isolate themselves in order to prevent the spread of the virus. Yeah, and then that was really kind of eye-opening for me, because in the past, I had always been researching how state surveillance was catching something physical. A person, for example, you know, a person of interest, or a physical object like a getaway car. And in this case, the state surveillance system was trying to track something that was completely invisible, left no tracks, and was way more contagious than, you know, police could react. It was like a 3 or 4 day incubation period. It was to me, it felt like a monstrous challenge, but the Chinese government took it on. And in the early days, at least in the first year of COVID, they managed to keep COVID down extremely, extremely well. So that was one of like the more interesting findings from COVID. The second really interesting thing to me that stuck out when I was just watching COVID play out was how, you know, early in the days of our book research, we used to talk to experts that would tell us every sort of surveillance system you see in Xinjiang, every sinister surveillance system will eventually find their way out of Xinjiang to the rest of China. And at that point, I just couldn't believe it. I figured that maybe in the regions the communist government felt more restive, that could be possible, but not in like the wealthy cities like Beijing and Shanghai. It just didn't seem plausible. But with COVID, we saw like surveillance go from real-time surveillance of a group of ethnic minorities to real-time surveillance of everyone in China. Because ultimately, everyone in China, they were forced to download an app that tracked their movements for the past 14 days in order to assign a QR code for them. And this QR code would essentially be a health score, telling like officials on the street who are checking your QR code, you know, were you exposed to a COVID carrier or not? And this is like one of the big takeaways for COVID for me.
Yeah, I can definitely kind of, see how that, um, uh, affects just in kind of the kind of both sides of, how it is a fantastically efficient instrument, but also how, it kind of can easily be, it can be easily be misused. I have been asked to remind everyone to please share questions you have over YouTube chat, and there's one I see now. To what extent does the Chinese government surveillance already extend to Taiwan? Would either of you like to take that on?
Sure, I can take that one. Actually, I just recently, I've been living in Taiwan, actually recently, because since I was expelled from China in early 2020 in the middle of writing the book. Yeah, interestingly, I mean, China claims Taiwan as part of, the Communist Party claims Taiwan as part of China, but it really isn't. And it really doesn't have the ability on its own to conduct surveillance inside of Taiwan. I mean, it definitely conducts surveillance of Taiwan sort of remotely, just like any country would with another, could do with another country. But where Taiwan is actually really fascinating is on this question of COVID, right? Because the way they handled it, and one of the questions that sort of hovers over this entire story is, how are democracies going to deal with this, right? Because China has a very clear vision for how these technologies fit into a system of government, right? And they sort of believe that governments should use these technological capabilities and future technological capabilities to the greatest extent possible to maintain control and manage society, right? It's just very simple, clear vision. What did democracies do? How do democracies confront these tools, which are extremely powerful, right? As COVID has shown, but can really, obviously, kind of just destroy privacy, and sort of, and have really interesting implications for things like free will, right? And so Taiwan was really fascinating because when COVID hit, it did institute surveillance, but it did it in a very deliberately limited way that was trying to protect as much privacy as possible, while still being effective. And so, where China has apps, Taiwan deliberately did not build an app, right? Because they felt like it wasn't secure. Anytime you build a new app, there's all sorts of flaws in it. You could be leaking data, and it really wasn't necessary. So instead, they just used cell phone data, right? So they could do contact tracing through cell phone data. It wasn't as accurate, but it was accurate enough, right? And they did other things like, if people had to report, going to restaurants or bars, but they didn't want people to know what they were doing or where they were going, they could leave like an anonymous email address instead of their own email address, as long as the government knew who it was connected to. So things like that. And it worked. It was quite, people accepted it. And Taiwan was able to control COVID quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys do address that question of how democracy, or at least you asked that question of how democracy should be handling or could be handling these instruments of surveillance. And the one question I had while reading was how long can this bargain the government has made with the people be sustained, or and in a way, how at what point, or if the Chinese will ever outgrow kind of their rather their definition of privacy and their sense of its limited kind of use. Like, do we did either of you think that, in a generation or two, that the Chinese would evolve, that the people would evolve to a point where they prize privacy much more than they do now?
Right. I don't know. Obviously that's sort of, it's always dangerous, as anyone who writes about China knows, to
Speculate.
project too far into the future. I think it's a really interesting question, and people have asked this. People who look at surveillance or privacy in China ask this question often, right? And COVID actually is a good example of this, right? Where there are some people who've started to kind of rebel a little bit against the zero COVID policies in China, right? Because they're so stringent, and the technology and the other control measures are so suffocating. And it's also targeting wealthy people, like the people who we were talking about earlier, who would sort of in the cities, well-educated, who had developed a sense of privacy. They are starting to feel levels of surveillance and scrutiny that previously, only were sort of reserved for minority ethnic populations or criminals or that sort of thing. So you are starting to get some pushback, some pretty strong pushback. And so one question is whether, COVID is actually going to be if in the first phase, it was this event that really spread surveillance around the country, and a lot of people accepted it. And now, in the second phase, is it going to be actually the event that turns people against surveillance? It's really hard to answer.
Yes, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that, the base of privacy awareness in China is currently so low. I just can't see it happening in the near future. I think the difference between like the US and Western democracies and China is really the privacy awareness. And in the US, you had from the 1890s, like the Right to Privacy written by Samuel Brandeis and Lewis Warren. In China, it's only been in the last couple of decades that Chinese people have really started to understand and grasp what it means to have your data taken from you and exploited. And the reason why I'm actually not very optimistic that this level of privacy awareness will grow quickly is because half of Chinese citizens still don't live in the big cities. A lot of the privacy awareness that we've seen has come from people in the big cities. And it's really about the headspace, right? If you don't have the mind space to think about the idea of privacy, why would you? And if you're not living in a city, you're likely living in, a more poorer county or in the rural countryside where things like material wants and physiological needs are just way more prioritized and important than the idea of privacy. So I'm actually not very optimistic on that front.
I think I might agree with you on that. Reading this book made me, and the idea of kind of the future of surveillance in China and the priority of privacy in Chinese citizens' minds made me think about how helpless, like how much more helpless one can feel if they come to prioritize something that they cannot control. Like I remember when in the US, when everyone suddenly found out that Facebook had all this data, and there was just this kind of, that there were these mechanisms where like you could then switch the settings, where like you could, go to the media about how violated you felt, and how with surveillance, and with kind of your own opinion about the value of your privacy, there's nothing you can really do about how that's taken from you in a authoritarian country, and how it actually is to your to the detriment of your mental health to value your privacy, because it's not like then you wake up tomorrow and have the tools to engage with that.
Right. Yeah. I think that's one of the lessons of China, right? Is that things can come at you fast, basically, right? And like the way that these systems have been rolled out, especially now with COVID, sort of so that they cover everyone in the country is, I mean, it's hard to imagine how anyone in China can resist, right? The tools the Chinese government has now to exert control are just so pervasive and so fast, right? They react so quickly. Sort of combined with Xi Jinping, China's leader, the sort of his own willingness to deploy these technologies kind of to their fullest extent, it really makes it hard to see how you can resist. And I think that's, if you're living in a democracy, that is something to think about, right? I mean, I think anyone who thinks about these issues realizes that democracies were sort of not prepared for Silicon Valley, right? We didn't see it coming. We didn't know how to react to it. And by the time we started thinking about it, companies like Google and Amazon, Facebook, they all owned huge amounts of our data, right? And so it's kind of too late to roll that back now, and we have to sort of struggle to figure out how to manage it. There is, we're still kind of at the early stages of the state surveillance rollout in the United States. I mean, it's there, and it's not going to ever be reversed. But I think that is the question that hovers over democracies: is how do they get in front of this? Or people who live in democracies, people who vote in democracies, like how do you get ahead of this, and how are you going to manage it and regulate it so that it doesn't, we don't get to that point of no return.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys mentioned, having proportional responses, which I thought, I mean, because there's such a, there's just no easy answers to this question, kind of having, do you need facial kind of profiling for minor crimes? Is that sacrifice of your privacy worth it versus when it means much greater harm to a large number of people? And I guess most importantly, who gets to make that decision about proportions, about what what activity is worth surveilling versus ones in which we would rather everyone would rather keep their privacy, and some small minor crimes will fall through the net. I thought it was in China, it was very interesting when I did a piece a few years ago on filters, on kind of these facial filtering apps, and where you can basically give yourself plastic surgery kind of on the apps. And now I see so many of so much of that is coming to the US. I mean, it's really spreading, like it's becoming very popular here. But when I would ask everyone, whether they minded my taking a picture of them, kind of these people who are getting plastic surgery, or, these young influencers, because that's just what I had been accustomed to doing in the US. And everyone that I asked just thought the question, they only thought the question was kind of inexplicable, because they just wanted to make sure, they wanted me to take pictures of them, but they just wanted to make sure that it wasn't on the native camera on the phone, that their faces were that their face had been basically digitally altered to be kind of their most attractive. And I thought that was so interesting. It wasn't like the question I was asking was about their privacy, and and they were like, no, I don't care if I look like myself. I don't care if people realize that, like, this is me. I just want to be my most attractive self. And I thought that was just such an interesting, I don't know if it's a miscommunication, but like just that such an interesting example of this difference in values.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, actually. And what I mean, an interesting factoid is that the companies that build a lot of the technology that sort of automatically smooth out your wrinkles and kind of give you like digital Botox are the same companies that do facial recognition technology. It's like the same. It's basically the same technology, right? And they Yeah, yeah. So it's pretty fascinating.
And that, yeah, I was thinking about how, because they're so attuned to the faces and how you alter your faces and just kind of, and how can you, and how to to look plausibly human while kind of changing every single feature. I thought that I mean, how could that not, be connected to facial recognition, right? It's all, it's all about kind of, recognizing and also improving upon the face. Well, we have a last question here. We have about 5 minutes remaining, and it's about NEVs, which I'm understanding to be new energy vehicles. And the question is, with the rapid acceptance of new energy vehicles in China, there's an ever-growing network of mobile cameras and sensors, which are in these vehicles. What data is being sent to new energy vehicle firms and the Chinese government? I know that's not quite kind of in the in the scope of the book, but would either of you want to just give that a shot?
Yeah, that is actually a tricky subject that wouldn't really be in our expertise, but I'll take a shot at just kind of explaining, because it really falls. It's a similar corporate dynamic that you see with other companies that you would see with the new energy vehicle industry. I think with new energy vehicles, a lot of these companies are also trying to improve like automotive technology with like autonomous driving systems, for example. And because of that, they've been installing like mobile cameras and networks on and sensors on top of cars. Most of the data that's being collected by these sensors and mobile cameras will be retained by the new energy vehicle firms, simply because a lot of the data is used to refine whatever algorithms they're using. For example, with autonomous driving, just to make sure that the car is stopping when there is like a obstacle ahead, or if there's someone crossing. So a lot of the data would be retained just to reinforce and to feedback and to make their algorithms better. Whether they actually share the data with the Chinese government, it's still a very open question, and we haven't seen any cases of it so far. But what I could say is mapping data is extremely important and sensitive to the Chinese government. So this means that, at least for the new energy vehicle companies, they would be under more pressure to keep their data secure and not exposed to like cybersecurity leaks, for example, because mapping data would give anybody data about military installations in China or where army bases are kept. And this is something that the Chinese government does not want to share. So it's hard to say, if the real-time data will be shared with the Chinese government. And honestly, I don't think so. But what we can at least conclude is such data will not be made public and will be subject to more scrutiny.
Right. I mean, I just wanted to add one thing here, which is if you want to, I think sort of telling development in this space is that Tesla vehicles, which are very popular in China, and Teslas have immense numbers of cameras all over them, right, and sensors. They're banned from sensitive government compounds and military installations, right, because the Chinese government is worried that data will, the Tesla might end up sharing it with the U.S. government. So if they're worried about that happening in the U.S., I think you can maybe infer what they themselves would like to do with that data in China.
No, that's very that's really interesting. I was just thinking that that increasingly just the world over, there are so few spaces where you are not surveilled in one way, in one way or another. I mean, even I live in New York City, and I live in the East Village, and I asked my super about, like, is the East Village, like how, I live really close to, I live on the second floor, and there's the fire escape ladder, like, you know, anyone above like my height, 5'4", can basically pull it down. And the super looked at me like I was crazy. He was like, there are cameras everywhere. Like no one's gonna burgle you because like their face will be so readily identifiable. He was like, it won't even matter if there's like a ladder directly from your bedroom window to like, you know, right below, like no one's gonna burgle you. Like it was reassuring, but it was frightening at the same time. Like, yes, like I guess, you know, like that reduces the chance of being burgled, but it also made me think like, I mean, every inch of this city is under under the lens of some camera, and what does it mean not to have like a single moment that's not documented? And on that cheerful note, I really want to thank Josh and Eliza. I mean, you know, authors of this terrific book, Surveillance State Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control. And please pick up a copy at your local bookstore if you want to go, you know, deeper into the topics that we discussed. If you would like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and impersonal programming possible, please visit the Commonwealth Club website. That's commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Jiayang Fan. Take care and have a great evening.